Pepsi Prebiotic Cola in original and cherry vanilla. That Pepsi taste you love with no artificial sweeteners and 3 grams of prebiotic fiber. Pepsi Prebiotic Cola. Unbelievably Pepsi.
It's said everything happens for a reason, but maybe everything happens for a Reese's. Take noise-canceling headphones. Do they block hearing to heighten taste? That sound seems to show everything happens for a Reese's.
At IKEA, your dreams can come true. Well, maybe not the ones where you're being chased by a monster. We're talking about kitchen dreams. And there are IKEA products and solutions for all of them. Whether it's a whole new kitchen, a statement glassware set, or just new cutlery. If you got big dreams or small dreams in any size of budget, IKEA can help you bring them to life. Visit IKEA.us/dreamkitchen to learn more. Dream the possibility.
Canada's Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is up for debate at the moment. In fact, it is before the Supreme Court. Should the Supreme Court be able to change the Charter of Rights, though, without any say of the general public, of the political class? That appears to be what is going on right now in the battle over Bill 21 out of Quebec. We've talked about that before, but today, a different view of how all this came together. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. And today, an interview with one of the few people who got to sign it, and the only one that is still with us today. Brian Peckford was Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador from 1979 until 1989, and was there for the discussions that led to Pierre Trudeau patriating the Constitution, installing a charter into Canada, and the compromise that he had to strike with the premiers. And he joins me now from beautiful British Columbia. Premier, thanks for the time.
Thank you, sir, for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
So there is a lot of debate and a lot of false claims about it, but let's go back to the beginning. When did you first hear about Pierre Trudeau deciding that he wanted to have a Charter of Rights? Because that's not really part of our judicial heritage, our political heritage coming out of the British common law system. But he was determined. So when did you hear that this was something he wanted to add on above and beyond John Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights?
Well, back in 1980, I became Premier in 1979. But in early 1980, there was a discussion about patriating the Constitution. In other words, doing something that we had been impossible to do. We started this business of trying to patriate the Constitution. In other words, make sure that in future, all changes to our Constitution will be done in Canada. That's what the patriation thing meant. It meant an amending formula, because we never had an amending formula, and why, therefore, we had to go back to Britain up until 1981.
Any changes had to go through the British Parliament prior to that?
We didn't have anything in the BNA Act demonstrating or authorizing Canada's Parliament to change the Constitution. And so we needed to go back to the British Parliament. But this has been ongoing since 1927. 1927, 1931, 1935, 1950, 1964, 1971, 1972, 1975, 76, 1977, and 1979. There have been efforts to patriate the Constitution. Now, that wasn't to necessarily include the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but there had been talk. If you go back through the history and look at it in detail with the provinces and the federal government, there had been talk because of what happened in the United States back in 1776 about having something to enshrine our rights. That's why John Diefenbaker did what he did back in 1960 in the Bill of Rights, but that was only a federal statute. Canadians don't understand. Many ask me, why do we need a Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Because we already had the Bill of Rights. But that Bill of Rights was a federal statute. It was not a constitutional provision. And so therefore it only applied to things that were involved with the federal government.
It didn't apply to provincial laws. It didn't apply to municipal governments, et cetera.
Exactly. So it was just a federal statute. And Canada is not federal. Canada is not a federal government. Canada is a federal government and the provinces and the territories. And that's been made clear right from day one, the BNA Act. But in any case, I want to make it clear that the whole business of patriating the Constitution was nothing new in the 80 or 81 when it was raised again, because it had been raised 11 or 12 times earlier. Informal discussions and conferences were held and so on to try to find an amending formula. But there was also talk about more individual rights, as is witnessed by the Bill of Rights of 1960. So it wasn't just a Pierre Elliott Trudeau thing, even though especially Central Canada likes to think that way, because they're there near the federal government, and they're getting fed all this stuff by the federal government over the years. For example, you said in your introduction that Trudeau patriated the Constitution. He didn't.
Who did then?
The provinces and the federal government patriated the Constitution. It's not his Constitution. It's not his charter.
He could not do it without your cooperation and that of your fellow premiers.
Or we didn't do it without the cooperation of the federal government. You can turn it around right on its head. Yeah, exactly. But the whole idea that this was a Pierre Elliott Trudeau thing has been a myth that's been around forever. Notwithstanding great old John Diefenbaker introducing the whole question of rights for individuals back in 1960. The Bill of Rights is mentioned lots of times, and then it's conveniently forgotten when people want to say this is Pierre Elliott Trudeau's charter, when it's not. And his signature on it, when you go to get a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you'll see a signature on it. That's unconstitutional, and that's wrong. That signature should be Pierre Elliott Trudeau, yes, and all the premiers who signed on to the Patriation Agreement, which became the Constitution Act of 1982.
You mentioned Diefenbaker's 1960 Bill of Rights being cited often. I have cited it before because people will say, well, we don't have freedom of speech in Canada. We have freedom of expression, which, of course, expression includes speech, but it is directly in Diefenbaker's 1960 Bill of Rights. It does say freedom of speech. I don't know why that argument is always had, but it is an ongoing one. You mentioned 1931, and I know you've read up on the history of this. I would have imagined that was around the time that the Statute of Westminster.
Yes, it was during the Statute of Westminster.
Britain granted full legal autonomy to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Irish Free State, Newfoundland, your home province. Yeah, was still not part of Canada yet. So why did they not, if they were going that far, and that's widely recognized as when Canada took on its own foreign affairs policy, for example, why did we not patriate the Constitution then? It seems like a pretty big move. Why not go the next step?
Because there was no agreement on the amending formula. 1927, they couldn't get it. Then 1931, the Statute of Westminster was passed, but there was no agreement. Later, in 1935, right after the Statute of Westminster, there was another meeting and initiative to patriate the Constitution, and that failed. It failed again in 50, failed again in 64, it failed again in 71. So the whole idea of patriating the Constitution at the time of the Statute of Westminster is a good suggestion, but there wasn't agreement among the provinces for an amending formula of how we would change it if we patriated.
So walk us through how the amending formula came to be in 1980-81 then, because obviously an agreement was had.
Right, exactly. Because there became, once we began in June 1980, when there was an agreement after, by the way, the Quebec referendum earlier that year in May, the Prime Minister had said, and I had wrote him about this, and other premiers did too, that he couldn't do a bunch of things that Quebec wanted, but he would initiate a renewed federalism, he called it. And if you go back and look at the phraseologies, that's what was used, a renewed federalism. Quebec hung on to that like it was the last, really, really thought that was an important phraseology for the Prime Minister to use. And so because we were all concerned about where Quebec was going, and so we were all concerned about this. And so there was a meeting after the referendum amongst the provinces and the federal government to talk about, what can we do here? I had written to the Prime Minister saying I supported renewed federalism, and was eager to participate in any way that would see that occur. Other premiers did too. And so we had a meeting, and 12 items were agreed to further discuss to try to patriate the Constitution. That was in June 1980. And then we had, in September, a full-scale constitutional first ministers meeting to further see how far the provinces and the federal government had come on the 12-point agenda. That 12-point agenda was discussed from June to September by ministers from all the provinces and the federal government, with input from their cabinets and their premiers and first ministers. And so there was a lot of work done between June and September. And then in September, what happened was we had a meeting to see whether we could get agreement to patriate, plus individual rights and freedoms. But there was no agreement. Trudeau was very frustrated by that, even though it was only from June to September, not a long time for something so fundamental to occur. And so he decided that he would go his own way. So in October, he announced that he was going to introduce legislation whereby they'd go on their own as a federal government, like Sean Fraser is trying to do now. Like Sean Fraser and the federal government trying to do now. It's really ironic. And so we're going to pass legislation and patriate the Constitution, have a charter of rights as part of it, because we can do that. Well, he introduced legislation, it got passed because he had a majority government. And but the thing started to go off the rails because the provinces had initiated opposition to this piece of legislation, and we went to court in Newfoundland, they went to court in Quebec, and they went to court in Manitoba to see whether, in fact, what the federal government was trying to do was constitutional. Okay, and so as that was going on, there was a lot of debate in the House of Commons and amongst the Conservative Party of Canada and others, thinkers and so on, about what the federal government was doing. This was unilateral. This was unusual because what he was doing was going to affect the powers of the provinces. And by the way, I looked up this morning. Well, we'll come to that in a minute. But I look up this morning. It's never been done before in the history of Canada up to 1981, where a federal government went ahead to make changes to the Constitution which would affect the powers of the provinces without consulting and getting the consent of the provinces. This was breaking brand new ground. And so finally the federal government realized that they were in trouble, and they agreed with other parties and other groups that they should make a reference themselves. Not just should the Newfoundland and Manitoba and Quebec do it on behalf of the group of provinces who oppose what he was doing, but the federal government agreed, okay, we'll do our own reference, and we'll include, and we agreed, the references and the decisions of the other three courts. So one big court case. And the result of that court case, this is never mentioned anymore, was that the Supreme Court of Canada, whose members, many of whom were great friends of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's, voted against him and said, what you are trying to do is unconstitutional.
It was kind of a weird decision, if I understand correctly, in that they said, legally you can do this, but it will break convention and therefore is unconstitutional. So you can't do it.
Exactly. But that's the important point. And Trudeau knew right away, as did everybody else in Canada, because everybody likes to bring up this little technical division between legality and constitutionality. Constitutionality trumps legality every time. So let's forget it, because it's not really relevant.
It is an odd way to do it. Legally you can, but by convention you can't, ergo unconstitutional.
It's because convention was very much a part of the Constitution right from day one. The Constitution of Canada is made up of, today, the BNA Act and the 1982 Act, plus other provisions that had been agreed to between all the parties during the time through the courts, which became custom, or which became known as convention in constitutional terms. So he knew, the federal government knew, and everybody in Canada knew what the federal government was trying to do was unconstitutional. That's the important point. People who are on the federal government side love to emphasize the business of the legality. But legality doesn't work if it's unconstitutional. So constitutional trumps legality every time. That's a minor point which has become enlarged by people who want to take the federal government side.
Oh, and there are a great many of them among my colleagues in the media.
Oh my, they're millions. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And what happened? Did the Trudeau take the legality side and say, I can still go ahead and do this? Not on your life, because he knew he couldn't. It was unconstitutional, because constitutionality trumps legality every time. And he came back to the table to get an agreement, to see if he could get an agreement in light of the decision by the Supreme Court.
Did that Supreme Court loss change how he was negotiating with you and the other premiers? Did his attitude change?
Of course, totally.
How?
Well, in the sense that they were looking for ways to appease or to satisfy what the court was saying. But, however, at the end of the day, he was an extremely stubborn man, and he still held out to try to get as much as he could get from his point of view. And that was the 3rd and 4th and 5th November 1981, after the Supreme Court of Canada decision had come down in September. So that was just a few months later. But to make a long story short, I put forward on behalf of the government of Newfoundland on the night of the 4th a written proposal, which is in my book, and it's the written proposal that led to the Patriation agreement being signed the next day, and worked on it through the night with a number of other provinces. And then the group of 8 of provinces that had opposed the federal government's unilateralism through their parliament met and approved what we had devised that night, and authorized me to make the presentation to the last meeting on the 5th of November to the full First Ministers' Conference later that morning. And I did, and that proposal, with a number of changes, became the Patriation Agreement.
Now, the group of 8 did not include a man who would have been one of the more powerful premiers in the country at the time, Bill Davis of Ontario. And I ask this as someone sitting in Queen's Park at the Ontario legislature. Why was Bill Davis not on taking the side of the rest of the provinces? Was he so closely aligned with Pierre Trudeau?
We were always puzzled by that, why Richard Hatfield and Bill Davis would take the side of the federal government, and it never got clear to me why. I've never been satisfied with anything that Ontario said at the time, or anything I've read since, to understand Bill Davis's position. It was quite peculiar to us. And by the way, our group of 8, when we got talking on the phone and stuff, when we decided to oppose what Trudeau was trying to do, this came up many, many times. A lot of the provinces were puzzled, because a lot of the provinces, I mean, we had dealings all the time with Ontario, with each other on different matters. We had a Premier's Conference every year, and so it was natural, for us to be quite close in talking about all kinds of matter of things. But it never. Richard Hatfield was a bit more, we understood, in the sense that he was a bit more peculiar and unusual in his approach to a lot of things. So that didn't surprise us, because he was more eccentric. But Bill Davis was more along the lines, and his government and his intergovernmental affairs people, along the lines that we were, at least at the bureaucratic level, at the deputy minister level. So that was always a puzzle to us of why he would take that position.
So before we move on to the issue of the charter, you proposed this on November 4th, the amending formula part. It gets adopted November 5th. Where were these negotiations taking place? I've heard different things. The kitchen at the Chateau Laurier, Mama Teresa's,
That's all myth. All that kitchen stuff and all that other stuff is myth. The only documentation that is available to us is what I presented on the night of the 4th, with a number of the group of 8 and representatives from the others, except Quebec. Quebec was the only one. And there's an interesting sidelight, because this has come up too a lot by a lot of your confreres in talking about this. We ignored Quebec, right? It was as some professors said, the night of the long knives, which, by the way, when I questioned them, they couldn't prove what they were talking about. But we tried to get Quebec in their hotel rooms, and they weren't there. We found out later that the Quebec delegation had gone over the hall for a late dinner. So they weren't available. So I initiated a meeting with Saskatchewan, with Alberta, with British Columbia, with PEI, and with Nova Scotia, and on the phone with Manitoba. Okay? And through the night, they looked at my proposal, and through the night, with some not big changes. This is all in my book, by the way. This is all in my book. All these documents are in my book. It was a bestseller in 2012, Globe and Mail bestseller.
Can
And
people still find it?
You can still pick it up on Kindle, and all the documents are in there. And it's been completely ignored by the what shall I say, by the establishment, because all the documents are there. Nobody else had the documents, only us. I went to look for the documents in the Intergovernmental Secretariat of the federal government when I was writing this book, and they had disappeared. Hallelujah. How come they disappeared? Anyway, they're all here. I still have the physical ones in my files here in my office. Okay. The documents are all here. So that's the only one. And Prime Minister Trudeau himself, the next day in interviews with the media, where I was present at the same time because they were interviewing both of us, looked at me and he said, here's the person and his proposal that broke the impasse today.
It's funny. You hear about the night of the long knives. You hear about Mama Teresa's, the kitchen stuff, all of that. And that is, as you say, the myth that has grown up. And yet, I talked to you, who was the premier of Newfoundland at the time, and I talked to Norman Spector, who was I can't remember if the exact title was principal secretary or chief of staff at the time, to Bill Bennett, the premier of British Columbia. So people from opposite ends of the country, and you two both have the same story.
Oh, of course, and that's the only documentation. I mean, it's really funny how the media have acted on this ever since 1982, because I have the documentation. The documentation is there. And Peter Lougheed confirmed that in his book. Mel Smith, who was, by the way, the chief constitutional advisor for Bill Bennett, because Spector was just the principal secretary, but the person who was advising Bennett in the documents that he made that he gave to the University of the Fraser Valley, which I found, by the way. Nobody else had found these documents, only me, when I went to write this book, in which he referred to the meeting that I had that night and my proposal and so on.
So, all right, we need to take a quick break, but when we come back, let's get into the issue of the charter and the notwithstanding clause, because you and I are talking on April 17th, 2026. It's the 44th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution and the charter, bringing it into force. And we've got some puff pieces from my colleagues in the media claiming things that just aren't so. Back in moments.
So good, so good, so good.
Spring styles are at Nordstrom Rack stores now, and they're up to 60% off. Stock up and save on Rag & Bone, Madewell, Vince, All Saints, and more of your favorites.
How did I not know Rack has Adidas?
Why do we rack? For the hottest deals. Just so many good brands.
Join the Nordy Club to unlock exclusive discounts, shop new arrivals first, and more. Plus, buy online and pick up at your favorite Rack store for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
This episode is brought to you by Welch's Fruit Snacks. Big news for your kids' lunchbox. Welch's Fruit Snacks are now made without any artificial dyes. A snack parents can feel good about, and the same delicious taste kids can't get enough of. All made with no artificial dyes. Try Welch's Fruit Snacks today.
Lowe's has the brands pros trust to get the job done. You can now shop new Catalyst fencing solutions and save big when you do. 10% off when you buy in bulk. Plus, save $180 on a DeWalt 12-inch dual bevel sliding compound miter saw. Now just $449. Our best lineup is here at Lowe's. Valid through 5/6 while supplies last. Selection varies by location.
There were so many missed opportunities to catch this before the devastating thing happened.
A third of them we found literally in the phone book. These people were not afraid. They knew that nobody was effectively hunting them. They knew they had escaped justice, that they were going to die in their beds.
When I give talks at law schools, is that the charter ultimately is empowering a minority, and it's empowering a minority that's a guild across the country, and it's a fairly elite guild, and the guild is lawyers.
Families who were split by referendum and brothers and sisters who never talked to each other for years after the referendum because they were so angry at each other because of emotions on both sides.
The reason he was assassinated was not because he was trying to put a satellite into space, but because the gun that he was creating had other applications that made him and the gun very dangerous.
It's finally here. A new season of Canada Did What? Host Media podcast that revisits the big Canadian political events you might think you remember and tells you the real story you never knew. I'm Tristan Hopper. The voices you just heard are from our brand new Season 2. We will unpack some of the pivotal moments that helped define our country, often without a vote, usually without a plan, and sometimes without anyone admitting what they'd done. We'll find out how Canada became a welcoming paradise for untold numbers of Nazi war criminals after the Second World War. We let them build monuments to their wartime exploits and even ended up honoring a Nazi fighter in the House of Commons. And I'm sorry to say that none of that happened by accident. We'll bring you the little-known story of a troubled Canadian rocket scientist who turned to a sinister life of selling giant guns to terrible people. And if that sounds like a spy novel, it ends like one too. You'll hear the behind-the-scenes story of Quebec's attempted secession from Canada and how very close we came to a political crisis that would have made Brexit look like a picnic. You'll hear about how the much-celebrated Charter of Rights and Freedoms turned into something its creators never wanted, and how many of the most extravagant warnings about the document were all quickly proven true. And you'll even hear about how authorities bungled multiple chances to stop the deadliest terrorist attack in our country's history, and then proceeded to pretend it never happened. These aren't dusty history lessons. They're stories about power, ambition, madness, and the things about Canada that a lot of people would rather ignore. But not you. You won't want to miss an episode. Subscribe to make sure you get all of Season 2 starting March 2026, anywhere you get your podcasts.
So, Mr. Peckford, I have to ask you, can you respond to this written in a CBC article today? And I want to point out, this is not CBC quoting someone. This is a CBC reporter, not a columnist, a reporter, just putting this out there as fact. Here's the quote. Section 33, that would be the notwithstanding clause, Section 33 is only supposed to be used as a measure of last resort in exceptional circumstances, but provinces are frequently turning to it to bypass judicial reviews. Your thoughts on that as someone who was there for the grand bargain that allowed for the notwithstanding clause to be there, the amending formula to be there, for the Constitution to be patriated?
Number one, where is the authority? Where does that reporter, where is the evidence, or where is the authority to say that it was only supposed to be used very sparingly? I think she's just creating that or repeating it from somebody else. It's not in the Constitution of 1982. So where is this coming from? It's not part of the Constitution. She's making it up, or somebody else is making it up. Number two, it just so happens, however, that since 44 years ago, when the 82 Act came into being, it's only been used 12 or 13 times. In 42 years, 43 years. 12 times in 43 years. That's the actual reality of the situation. So I don't know if you...
Most of it by Quebec, but not all of it.
Well, there was other provinces that used it 3 and 4 times as well. Yeah. So number one, that there's no foundation anywhere in the Constitution to support what that CBC reporter said. Number two, the fact of the matter is, after 44 years, it's only been used 12 or 13 times.
So, but there has been this pressure by folks, especially here in central Canada to delegitimize the notwithstanding clause
Exactly.
since the beginning. Where did that start? Was Trudeau really opposed to the notwithstanding clause? Was it people around him that started this?
Yes. Yes, he was opposed from he didn't want, this is why when people say it's Trudeau's charter, it makes me laugh as a person who was there. I witnessed all of this. I was the one who made the presentation that led to the Patriation Agreement. He was not in favor of this. He wanted a more uniform, he wanted a more centralized Canada. We wanted the Canada that existed through the BNA Act and the separation of powers, right, the division of powers, whatever you want to call it. And so he was opposed to this notwithstanding clause. He did not want it, but he was forced if he wanted to be a part of the New Deal. And of course, at the time, there were a lot of pressure on all of us that after all of these years, that we're going to have to do something. This is long, 1867, and we still haven't got the power to amend our own constitution. How foolish is that? I mean, how immature is that? So we understood the gravity of the situation, especially as it developed after June 1980, the discussions of September 1980, and we wanted to continue the discussions after September, even though there was an agreement. We weren't ready to throw in the towel. But Trudeau was, and that's when he went to court. He went to court. But right up until the night and morning of the November 4th and 5th, the federal government were opposed to this. And when they signed it, they signed it reluctantly. So you can be guaranteed that within the confines of the federal government generally, within the confines of most of the Ontario bureaucracy, which then supported Davis and so on, that there were a lot of people and in the media who were on Trudeau's side and who were against what we had done.
You had premiers from across the country and across the political spectrum supporting it. It was yourself, Bill Bennett, Sterling Lyon. You had people like Alan Blakeney, who, very much a prairie socialist New Democrat premier, supported it. Was Davis against the notwithstanding clause? Was he siding with Trudeau on that as well?
They were mushy. Near the end, in those third, fourth, and fifth, the Ontario realized that they really got to try to help form it, be the big province that they were. And by the way, which is not recorded very often, there was a secret meeting which Ontario was involved in with Trudeau and representatives of the Group of Eight on the night of the 3rd, or the night of the 3rd, in which British Columbia, there were a number of proposals coming forward from Saskatchewan, British Columbia in particular, and then mine. Mine was the third one. There were others besides mine from the provinces. And the Group of Eight chose 2 or 3 premiers who were, what shall I say, not that Trudeau wasn't totally negative towards, because he and I didn't get along at all. And other premiers were the same way. So we chose 2 or 3 premiers with Bill Davis and others to secretly, and Trudeau agreed, and this was all secret, to look for a compromise. And he rejected everything. So Ontario was, at the end, trying to maneuver themselves into being the broker to put something together. So it was never clear when you asked the question directly to me whether they were opposed or in favor of the notwithstanding clause. That remains in my mind and in all the notes I have an open question. What we do know, because it happened, and I was a part of seeing that it happened, that secret meeting with Trudeau to try to forego and have the next day be a little bit more, cooperative and a chance to get a deal. But that 4th day, the November 4th, where the Saskatchewan presented their proposal. BC, by the way, backed off on their proposal and didn't present it, which we were very upset about. But then Saskatchewan had one and they presented theirs, all of which went nowhere. And that led to that night when I made that presentation secretly in a hotel room to the group of 8, which led to the Patriation Agreement on the 5th. So Ontario, to be fair to them, as fair as I can, because they then perpetrated the kitchen thing and all that with Romano and the Attorney General of Ontario and Jean Chrétien. We never saw that. That never turned up anywhere. We never saw that. And Romano wasn't at the meeting that night with his government. It was we don't know where he was, but Howard Leeson was there, the constitutional advisor to Blakeney, and Blakeney was there. It was in Blakeney's suite, as a matter of fact, that all this occurred. We went over to the Saskatchewan suite and had the people from Alberta, people from British Columbia, like I say, Nova Scotia, PEI, and Manitoba on the phone. So it is fair to say that near the end, Ontario was trying to assist in brokering something. But where they were on any individual item was difficult to say.
That's interesting. People in Ontario tend to put country first over province.
They do so.
Compared to if you're in Newfoundland, it's, you're Newfoundlander and Canadian. Ontarians, a lot of them probably wouldn't know the word Ontarian because they just don't use it. It's Canada first, which is a different mentality. And perhaps that was part of what was at play.
Could very well be. There was no question. I mean, the intergovernmental affairs people, a lot of people that I dealt with in Ontario, I mean, up until then and afterwards with other premiers, were very, very reasonable, sensible, highly competent people. There's absolutely no question about that. I would never deny their competence. I would deny their judgment in this particular case.
Part of the concern for ensuring there was a notwithstanding clause was judicial overreach and judges having the final say. There's a quote from Peter Lougheed about, it didn't want the country ruled by judges, and he said, now we are. That was several years ago, obviously. What is your view now? Because I look at provinces looking to use the notwithstanding clause now. In my view is that if it is happening more frequently, or even talked about as a potential remedy more frequently, it is because the courts are overstepping their bounds.
Absolutely no question. But let me just go back and put this in context, Brian. This is extremely important. When Trudeau, after September 1980, when we left the table, we were waiting to then agree to have another meeting and to continue the First Minister's Conference on the Constitution. We were not willing to throw in the towel, as I said earlier. There were people in our group of 8 who warned us that Trudeau was not serious about dealing with the provinces. We discounted it, including Quebec, of course, but others in the West and in the East. By the way, one of the great people involved in this patriation who's never mentioned, besides Lyon is the stalwart, by the way, and then Lougheed and Blakeney and Bennett, was Angus MacLean. Angus MacLean, the premier of PEI, was a common sense. He was in the Diefenbaker government. He was a minister of fisheries back in the Diefenbaker government. Had fought in the First World War and was a pilot and received a whole bunch of awards and went back to PEI and became a blueberry farmer and got involved in federal politics, then later in provincial politics, and happened to be the premier, thankfully, of PEI during this period. Okay, but I have to say to you, so after that, I want to say this. When Trudeau unilaterally, we couldn't believe it, some of us couldn't believe it, to the House of Commons, I'm going to do this on my own. That was crossing the Rubicon. For people like me, you can go and you can find my document. I was one of the first provinces, if not the first, to actually outline completely our constitutional position in August 1980 and talked about a charter, talked about individual rights. And it was made public and given to all the provinces and the federal government. We're very reasonable and very sensible. But when Trudeau and the federal government left the table and unilaterally went and did this without us knowing about it.
Did that make you decide that you needed that safety valve for the notwithstanding clause?
Well, we knew then that the federal government was not to be trusted. And even Angus MacLean, a very reasonable man who had been a federal minister, sensible man, one of my heroes. And when that happened, that, by the way, hurt our chances of getting Quebec on side. Real bad. Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, PEI. I had always been more on the side of the Western provinces than Nova Scotia in particular, perhaps not PEI. But that really hardened our position that in any deal that we struck, the provinces, we've got to be very, very careful that this federal overreach and judicial supremacy kind of stuff doesn't take full sway. That was very, very, very important. And it's often downplayed. I'm so glad I'm still around. And if Loughy was here today, or Bennett, or Blakeney, or McLean, or Buchanan, they would completely support what I'm saying.
Back to what I was asking earlier, do you think that provinces are looking to use the notwithstanding clause more now because judges are going further than they should?
But the evidence is not there to show that. It's talked about more. You know why, Brian? This is insidious. Because the federal government is now about trying to usurp and change the Constitution illegally, or unconstitutionally, better said.
So
they're now persuading people in the media, as I read, that we got to do something about this. This is getting out of hand. Well, it really isn't getting out of hand. It's really getting out of hand in his mind and the federal government's mind, because they think the time is right now to do this. They think this is about the best time that the court is going to be quite likely more sympathetic to them, and that this is a good opportunity to strike.
Let's talk about the amending formula then. There is an amending formula that you took a long time to agree to, and this was a big sticking point in the Patriation discussions. And you require 7 provinces with 50% of the population, but the current government, the Carney Liberal government in Ottawa, is trying to amend the Constitution with as little as 4 judges in the Bill 21 case. Does that seem right to you?
No, it's not right. But it's unconstitutional. What he's doing is hijacking the Constitution. Him and the court, the Supreme Court, should say to the federal government, we're not even going to entertain your factum, because this goes against everything, every constitutional principle that we have, including the fact that it's not in the Constitution. The federal government does not have the power, nor does the court. They're out of line. They're out of line. They have no authority. You can't point to me any authority that the federal government has or the Supreme Court of Canada has to change the Constitution on their own. By the way,
the wording in the Section 33 is very clear. There's nothing in it that says you can't use it more than once. It tells you how to use it more than once.
Exactly. By the way, the other thing that they never mentioned is that it's not, everybody seems to think that it's done by the government of that province. No. If they want to use the notwithstanding clause, they have to go to their legislature and get approval. It's not just a cabinet of Quebec or a cabinet of Alberta or a cabinet of Ontario that decides that they want to use the notwithstanding clause. They are forced to go to their legislature and get it approved by the legislature. And then it's only good for 5 years. And if they want to continue it, they got to go back and go to the legislature again. So it's extremely democratic. It's using the representative bodies that we have in existence, the legislatures of the provinces.
It seems that some people would like to go back to the myths that started to be created in 1980 and 81 and run based on that rather than what the document says.
Let me just quote you one other thing.
Sure.
In the court decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, In 1981, they say this: in no instance has an amendment to the Constitution been enacted which directly affected federal-provincial relationships in the sense of changing provincial legislative powers in the absence of federal consultation with and the consent of all the provinces. That's the Supreme Court of Canada.
I wish that precedent mattered to the Supreme Court of Canada, but I don't believe it does anymore. And
I don't think anything matters anymore. Honest to God.
I often point one of the reasons that I say that the federal or the Supreme Court is overstepping their bounds is you look at something like the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor case, where Justice Abella said it's time to give benediction to this idea.
Yes.
That's not a legal argument. As I've pointed out many times before, that's not a legal argument,
Good for you.
but it's now the law of the land.
Good for you. Yeah, good for you. And by the way, I mean, the nerve of Mr. Fraser to stand up, or Carney, or any of these people, and try to change unconstitutionally the constitution of the country when they're the ones who froze bank accounts during the truckers thing. They're the ones that the Federal Court of Appeal, the federal court has said were unconstitutional in implementing the Emergencies Act. The Federal Court of Appeal has already agreed with the federal court in doing this, and now it's before the Supreme Court of Canada because the federal government are trying to get the court to overturn what these federal courts have said, that this was unconstitutional. So here they are in a non-constitutional position right now because the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on the final thing on the Emergencies Act. But by the way, the Emergencies Act itself was unconstitutional in its implementation because it never conformed with the Charter. It never demonstrably justified their actions, which is part of Section 1.
Especially given what Chief Justice Richard Wagner has already said about the convoy, that is going to be a very interesting case to watch.
Well, he should recuse himself at the start because he is conflicted, totally conflicted. So the Chief Justice should never have anything to do with that Emergencies Act.
I would agree with that completely. Premier Peckford, it has been a great pleasure to speak to you, and hopefully we get a chance to do it again. Thanks so much.
I'm eager to do it whenever you're ready.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button, share this on social media, tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
There were so many missed opportunities to catch this before the devastating thing happened.
A third of them we found literally in the phone book. These people were not afraid. They knew that nobody was effectively hunting them. They knew they had escaped justice, that they were going to die in their beds.
When I give talks at law schools, is that the Charter ultimately is empowering a minority, and it's empowering a minority that's a guild across the country. And it's a fairly elite guild, and the guild is lawyers.
Families who were split by referendum and brothers and sisters who never talked to each other for years after the referendum because they were so angry at each other because of emotions on both sides.
The reason he was assassinated was not because he was trying to put a satellite into space, but because the gun that he was creating had other applications that made him and the gun very dangerous.
It's finally here. A new season of Canada Did What? Host Media podcast that revisits the big Canadian political events you might think you remember and tells you the real story you never knew. I'm Tristan Hopper. The voices you just heard are from our brand new Season 2. We will unpack some of the pivotal moments that helped define our country, often without a vote, usually without a plan, and sometimes without anyone admitting what they'd done. We'll find out how Canada became a welcoming paradise for untold numbers of Nazi war criminals after the Second World War. We let them build monuments to their wartime exploits and even ended up honoring a Nazi fighter in the House of Commons. And I'm sorry to say that none of that happened by accident. We'll bring you the little-known story of a troubled Canadian rocket scientist who turned to a sinister life of selling giant guns to terrible people. And if that sounds like a spy novel, it ends like one too. you'll hear the behind-the-scenes story of Quebec's attempted secession from Canada and how very close we came to a political crisis that would have made Brexit look like a picnic. You'll hear about how the much-celebrated Charter of Rights and Freedoms turned into something its creators never wanted, and how many of the most extravagant warnings about the document were all quickly proven true. And you'll even hear about how authorities bungled multiple chances to stop the deadliest terrorist attack in our country's history, and then proceeded to pretend it never happened. These aren't dusty history lessons. They're stories about power, ambition, madness, and the things about Canada that a lot of people would rather ignore. But not you. You won't want to miss an episode. Subscribe to make sure you get all of Season 2 starting March 2026, anywhere you get your podcasts.